not only did W have that much closer relationship with his father, and did they seek to obscure it, but also his father had a secret life. And this is a very important theme in Family of Secrets, that there was a president of the United States. He was vice president for 8 years, president for 4 years, and we didn't really know who he was. It turns out he was a lot like Vladimir Putin. He had spent his life secretly in intelligence operations. And in 1976, when he was named the director of the CIA, if you go back and you look at the articles, they all describe former Congressman George Bush, squeaky clean, brought in because the CIA is under tremendous scrutiny by the Senate and the House. And he's being brought in to sort of put a fresh face on it. And it was good enough for the media that this man, who had apparently no qualifications or experience, would be appointed to this incredibly sensitive position at this incredibly sensitive moment. The Congress was investigating whether the CIA was basically just totally out of control, just completely incompatible with a democracy. The notion that it was conducting illegal domestic operations, that it was conducting operations abroad, inimical to the values of the United States, including overthrowing and sometimes killing democratically elected leaders around the world. Congress was up in arms over this. They also were beginning to investigate domestic assassinations, the John F. Kennedy assassination, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, and so on, with an eye toward whether or not we had really gotten the full story and what this might or might not have to do with these intelligence agencies. Back to the Gammells and the Bushes. So that's why I'm saying the Gammell's company was thought of as CIA. And this is important. So this guy is putting money into George H.W. or Poppy Bush's business back in the 1950s, way before he's in government of any capacity. The Bushes and Gammell's remained close, and Poppy seemed to want to further develop this relationship. Poppy visited the Gammell's while on, quote, business trips. I put all these things in quotes because none of these things were what they seemed to be. Accompanied by young George W. Those repeat visits to the Gammell farm in Perthshire, Scotland, would yield a friendship between W. and Jimmy Gammell's son, Bill. That's the third generation of Gammells. And generations are very, very, very important in how power works in this country. A lot of us may not have those kind of families. We may barely know who our grandfather or great-grandfather was, or grandmother. But in those circles, that's extremely important, and they've got the pictures along the hallway of all the ancestors, and they're inculcating in their children the values that they stand for, values that if we found out about them, we wouldn't be too happy about. But this is really what you're looking at, is the ruling class. In 1959, when W was 13, Poppy sent him to spend the summer with the Gammells. Apparently he made a big impression on Bill, who was just 7 at that time. Now, again, one of the interesting things here is, do you remember when George W. Bush was running for president and they made a big to-do about that he wasn't qualified in part because he had apparently never traveled abroad? This was at the time a big deal, and people were shocked by this. How could somebody be president of the United States and have no experience and never even traveled abroad? There was some question as to whether he even had a passport. Well, that turns out to be untrue. And what I discovered in my research, 5 years of research for Family of Secrets, was that almost everything that we know about them is untrue. And this in itself is remarkable when you think about the sheer mass of the American media and all of these books that have been written, to think that they didn't catch almost any of these things. That's pretty staggering. So what I discovered was George W. Bush had traveled abroad. He traveled abroad quite a bit. But for some reason, that travel was something he didn't want to talk about. And so even with a choice between being ridiculed as ill-qualified for the presidency, in part because he hadn't traveled, or telling people that he had traveled and where he had traveled to, he chose to remain silent. The visits to the Gammell's was only one trip. He also worked for a company where he would go to places like Jamaica, where he was supposedly inspecting tropical greenhouses. Now, you can make what you want about that. At least that would show some business experience on his part, but he didn't want to talk about it. Okay, so anyway, the Gammell's. Bill Gammell went into business after being a rugby star, and he gained the type of success that got him dubbed the J.R. Ewing of Scotland. In 1980, the young Gammell, who like W had spent summers in college on Texas oil rigs, set up Cairn Energy Management to look for North American oil and gas deals for Scottish high rollers. His first deal was as one of W's earliest investors. You know, W had his various failed oil companies. Supposedly after W traveled to Scotland to pitch the idea. For their stake in our Busto Energy, Gammell and his investors got back just 20 cents on the dollar, but there were no hard feelings. In 1983, W was back in Scotland for Bill's wedding. Now, this is very important because what you find here is that none of these people's companies ever make a dime for the public, for the investors, and yet they flourish. They go on and on and on. Somehow the insiders do well, and somehow the companies continue to get investors, which raises the question, what are these companies? And as you know, we're finding out more and more that companies like Enron were not what we thought they were. And a lot of companies are not what we thought they were. But these kind of companies with the Bushes, basically what I realized as I researched them was that they were not real companies in the sense that the purpose, the reason they'd been set up was something else. In many cases it was for the purpose of laundering funds for intelligence operations and for other things, including the co-mixing of funds from various dictators around the world who were seeking to influence the United States government. I have an entire chapter in Family of Secrets on a company that W was involved with that had money from the Saudis, from what appeared to be from Ferdinand Marcos, the kleptocratic ruler of the Philippines, from the South African apartheid elements, from the Shah of Iran, a really, really fine crew of people, all putting money into this company that staked George W. Bush, made him rich, and helped him on his way to the governorship and then to the presidency. In any case, George and Bill remained close, and the two talked the day Bush was elected governor of Texas in 1994. The following year, Bill Gammell, whose company vice chairman was a former Labor energy minister, renewed his relationship with British Labor leader and soon-to-be Prime Minister Tony Blair. Bill Gammell's ties to Blair date back to prep school in Edinburgh. Now, see, this is very, very important because reporters never cover these things because it seems so silly. Who cares about who went to prep school with somebody? Well, you know who cares? They care. This is very, very important. They cement these relationships. That's why people want their kids to go to these schools, because you get a leg up. You get into these networks and you're set. So anyway, they were in prep school. They'd been friends and basketball teammates. Gammell arranged the initial meeting between the two world leaders, George Bush and Tony Blair, and Bush's first words to the British Prime Minister were, "I believe you know my old friend, Bill Gammell." Now, I'm almost done with this. I want to go a little bit more into this oil situation. Either Gammell was an extremely visionary businessman, or he had great connections, or both. One way or the other, along with Enron and Dick Cheney's Halliburton, Gammell's Karn Energy was soon making a fortune off oil in India, of all places, a country not noted for its prospects in that regard, not well known for that in any case. These Western relationships with India got a boost when George W. Bush succeeded Bill Clinton and replaced the United States' tough stance on the South Asian country's nuclear weapons program with one that was more forbearing. In any case, they then made a deal with Pat Robertson, the minister. They put a company together. He was a threat to the Bush family's political interests. They put a deal together with him and with these Scots, and this was another way of buying off political support. Blair's decision to back Bush enthusiastically on Iraq appears to have paid dividends. Now, this is very, very important because they could never have launched the invasion of Iraq if they did not have what they claim to be a coalition of the willing of all these countries around the world. And increasingly, it is becoming apparent that many of those countries are essentially blackmailed. They had listening devices. I don't know if you've heard any of this. They had listening devices where they were listening to their the U.S. was listening to their UN delegations. They were twisting their arms. They were threatening them. Tony Blair